My name is Mark Doran. I represent Alberta landowners, and I'm vice chair of the Polluter Pay Federation. That's an organization that protects land rights. Today, I'm going to do a video on a subject that I have tried to deal with before unsuccessfully at the Alberta Energy Regulator. The Honorable Minister of Environment and Protected Areas, Rebecca Schultz, recently, about a month ago, it's mid-January right now, 2024. About a month ago, the minister announced an Alberta well site reduction pilot program. It's designed to reduce the area leased from or acquired for well sites in Alberta. It's a bit problematic, and I'm going to do this video on that problem. So the subject of the video, oil and gas facility site spacing, what the minimum requirements are by law. This is all about spacing regulations that are enforceable by well licensees or contract operators at well sites and facility sites in Alberta, and the rules that are self-enforceable at well sites are set out in section 8.090 of the oil and gas conservation rules, and that section of those rules is entitled fired equipment and engine exhausts. The people that will be interested in this video, all Alberta landowners. The matters I'm going to discuss affect landowner safety and public safety, and directly impact the quantum of compensation to be paid to a landowner, including for annual compensation. The reason it's reemerged, as I mentioned, the site reduction pilot announced by the minister, Rebecca Schultz, raises issues that I've previously raised with the Alberta Energy Regulator and that have never been adjudicated or that remain unresolved. And so I'm going to reopen those matters now because of this introduction of this site reduction pilot. So let's start out with some background information, basic physics, basic chemistry about fires and explosions. So natural gas and air can be explosive. Operators, well licensees, etc., facility licensees must keep their gases that can be explosive on site until those gases are, at least until those gases are diluted in air to a degree that they are no longer in explosive mixtures when they drift off-site. Off-site gas migration is trespass, let's be clear. So what I have on the lower left is called a fire triangle. Now, most people like myself that have worked in upstream oil and gas, and particularly have done hot work on sites, etc., like welding or any other work that might cause an explosion, are aware of the fire triangle, as are all firemen, etc. So there's three elements that are required to have a fire or an explosion, and those are oxygen, heat, and fuel. Now, alternate to heat, we can have a chemical reaction or some kind of a chain reaction. So that's shown in bottom in green. Now, I've shown heat and chain reactions with a symbol banning them, because we have to keep those off site. And the reason is that, as I've shown, oxygen and air at any oil and gas site is always present. There's nothing we can do about that. Fuel, similarly, is always present or can potentially be present on any oil and gas site. And that's because we're producing oil. It's a fuel. We're producing natural gas. It's a fuel, or both. So if there's a leak, if a relief valve opened, if something goes wrong, and sometimes just because of gas being vented in the course of normal operations, legally or illegally, these explosive vapors can always be potentially present on site. So because those two things you can't really change, we must make sure that the source of ignition or heat or chain reaction are controlled on site. And that's what spacing regulations are all about. So now, natural gas and air, there is a lower explosive limit and an upper explosive limit. And depending on the nature of the hydrocarbon vapors, whether it's all methane or there's some ethane, propane, butane, etc., this is approximately between 5% in air at the lower limit and 15% in air. So at the upper limit. So if gases are present in approximately 5 to 15%, well, that's an explosive mixture. If it's less than 5% in air, well, and there's a source of ignition, we probably won't get a fire and explosion. And same thing with if it's all fuel and not enough air, we probably won't get a fire or an explosion. So what I'm going to be discussing mostly in this video is what I'm showing in the white box at the bottom, is that because there are so many variations of equipment that can go onto a well site, the spacing regulation it does dictate the minimum distance between a fire as defined, we'll come to that, or a source of ignition, something that can ignite these vapors, and any source of ignitable vapors, a well, an unlit flare end, a separator, relief valve, many things on a well site can emit ignitable vapors. So we need to maintain this minimum separation of 50 meters or 150 feet before we went to the metric system. That's the spacing regulation I'll be discussing further, but simplified, that's what it is. And because of this, it effectively dictates minimum site area, which I will get into next. So there are two types of spacing regulations that have been illustrated in something called the spacing diagram produced by the Alberta Energy Regulator, who is the regulator in Alberta that deals with all upstream oil and gas issues. I'm going to concentrate more on the first type, which are the provisions and minimum distances set out in section 8.090 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Rules, which effectively dictate minimum site areas I've already briefly alluded to. The second type of spacing regulation, I'm going to call them land development setback distances. And those are basically the minimum distance between certain activities, which are wells, which are tanks, and which are flare ends, to what's called surface improvements. So I've shown surface improvements outside the well site area. I've shown them by houses here. And surface improvements can be a house, a garage, a railroad track, any type of a right-of-way. Many things fit that description. There's a different distance from wells, tanks, and flare ends to roads. It's a lesser distance. It can be 40 meters, as I've shown here on the left. This gray bar here is a surveyed road. So what I've tried to do is shown a well site, the minimum boundary shown here in green. Inside that boundary are the spacing regulations of section 8.090 of the OGCR, and they're all the ones that are enforceable by operators have been shown in red. The ones that are not enforceable by operators are enforceable in most instances by municipalities, and they're shown in black. So those are to the off-site surface improvements, and those are the ones shown here in the bottom. So the other thing that's shown here is this red piping that's coming off the tanks. Subsection 7 of section 8.090 subsection 7 of the OGCR requires that tanks that emit any appreciable volume of gas must be conserved. It can be pulled off those tanks by a gas compressor and piped down a pipeline to be conserved, If not going to be conserved, then it must be burned to reduce the volume of hazardous or ignitable vapors that are being released to atmosphere within any given well site or tank battery site. So we'll just go to the next slide. Again here. So just to review what I've just shown, on the left are these land development setback distances. I won't read this off. The first three I've already more or less discussed. There are other setbacks to setback distances for land development, for example, from pipelines to surface improvements or from facilities to surface improvements that are set out in tables 6, 8, and 12 of Alberta Energy Regulator 056. And those are basically, they depend on the distances need to be increased depending on the amount of hydrogen sulfide or poisonous sour gas in a pipeline, or the rate at which hydrogen sulfide gas can escape from a wild well, etc. So the more sour the operation is, the larger the distance from any land development setback has to be. We have to maintain distances to housing, sometimes to towns or cities, etc. So we're going to concentrate in this video on the regulation shown on the left, which I've called spacing requirements, section 8.090 oil and gas conservation rules, and they're based on separation between sources of ignitable vapors, sources and potential sources of ignition, including those that can exist, especially those that can exist at any site boundary. And then there's two other laws. I won't go through these particular regulations in much detail, but included in some of the subsections of 8.090 of the oil and gas conservation rules, there's two laws incorporated by reference, and those are the Occupational Health and Safety Act. This law requires that people that are going into hazardous areas, more or less any well site or facility site, need to have the proper training. They need to be aware of the fire triangle. They need to be aware about what kind of activities can create a spark. They need to be aware of the dangers and hazards of explosion, etc. And then there's the Safeties Codes Act, part of which is the electrical code. And this is for more or less for electrical equipment, so that to make sure that any electrical equipment that's on site, particularly in your building, is done in what's called an explosion-proof manner. So regular wiring, for example, in your house, there's unprotected sparks. Any of those could cause an explosion if that type of wiring was used at or near a well site. So that's why we have these various laws, and all of these are enforceable by the operator at the well site, as we will come to. So the next thing I'm going to try to do is illustrate minimum well site size and the difference between a well site versus a facility site. So on the left, I've shown a well site in blue. It's perfectly square. It's 100 meters by 100 meters. That's just under 2.5 acres. And this reflects the provisions of section 8.090 subsection 2 of the OGCR rules. And we must have a minimum distance to any source of ignitable vapors, which can, source of ignition, which can occur. The well is the source of ignitable vapors, which can be present at all well site boundaries. So this means that the minimum well site size is 100 meters square. So let's be clear, a well site has a well only. It does not have any additional equipment like a flare or a separator or a tank or anything like that. So on the right, the well on the left would be connected to a flow line, or there would just be shut in because there is no flow line and there is no operations. And but on the right, once we start to add on-site equipment, which would normally be done if there's no pipeline to conserve the gas, which is common, or if there's no pipeline to truck oil from the site or to transport oil from the site. If it's an oil well, quite often they produce the tanks and truck will come along and take the oil away. So as soon as we add these extra bits of equipment, which are flaring, shown here at the top, or tanks, they all have to be a minimum distance from the well and a minimum distance from each other, etc., because of spacing rules that are throughout section 8.090. So, and if we draw a 50-meter circle around each one of these activities, well, the original site size, which is shown by the square, that's this site over here in blue, it becomes too small. And now we need additional area. So the tank battery boundary that would have to be an increased size to accommodate this equipment. And let's be clear, sometimes we get a license just for a well as an operator, and then we decide later to put this equipment on site. There is no, this equipment going on site is license exempt if the well is sweet, and if there's no injection well here, and if there's no gas compressor on site, it's exempt. You don't have to get approval from the AR, and that's why these regulations for spacing under section 8.090 are enforceable by the operator. So the red or the pink areas, those are the surface development setbacks. Those are the distance to off-site activities like houses, railroad tracks, etc., that I've already discussed, that could be increased depending on sour gas content, or even decreased by decision of the regulator. Increases are usually decided by the each municipal subdivision authority. The town or county has to have a subdivision authority. They can increase these distances that are to off-site distances to houses, roads, etc. In order to decrease those minimum regulated distances that I mentioned, then you need a decision and a relaxation permit issued by the Alberta Energy Regulator, and the operator has to undertake to do all things to keep those people safe in those relaxed areas. And so, so these are basically the difference between a well site, which would only have a well, and a facility site, licensed or not, which contains activities other than a well. So to recap, on the left, sources of ignitable vapors must be a 50 meters minimum separation from any sources of ignition. On the right, common sources of ignitable vapors, wells, relief valves on pressure vessels, unlit flare-ins, tanks, definitely. Common sources of ignition, these are infinite. These are absolutely infinite, but they include vehicles, farm implements, all farm implements, fencing tools. If you hammer on a nail or a fencing staple, for example, that creates sparks, which can cause explosions if the gas is in the right mixture. Lawnmowers, light switches in buildings that aren't explosion proof, etc. And all things that can potentially create a spark, humans in particular, that can be located at a site boundary. So that's the essence of the spacing regulations. So let's look at the actual regulations themselves. They're in section 8.090, and that's we'll start with the definition of fire, which is in section 1A of section 8.090 of these laws. And this is Alberta Regulation 151/1971. And this subsection 10 here was added by way of Alberta Regulation 2/76 in 1976. That amended this subsection 10 to make them enforceable by operators, and we'll come to that. So fire means any open or enclosed flame or other source of ignition except one, an open or enclosed flame from a flare stack or incinerator. Now, if that flame goes out, we have a source of ignition at that flare stack or incinerator. Or two, a source of ignition associated with the installation and operation of electrical equipment. So electrical equipment's done differently under the electrical code, and it's kind of eliminated here. So that's what that means. So here's the key law that dictates minimum site area effectively. And it says, no person shall create or cause to be created any fire within 50 meters of a well, oil storage tank, or other source of ignitable vapors. So no one can bring a source of ignition within the 50 meters, or cause a source of ignition, or bring a fire, or cause a fire to be created, because that's going to complete the fire triangle. Okay. Now we have to read this in conjunction with subsection 10, which is up here on the right. It says, each licensee of a well or operator of a facility at which there is located an oil storage tank or other source of ignitable vapor shall enforce the provisions of this section. In other words, each licensee of the well or operator of a facility must ensure that no person comes close to these sites creating a fire. So it's up to the operator to make sure no one comes close. So there's two ways to do that. Fence your site, put up signs, lock the gate, make sure nobody can get in, say, hey, do not enter, or man that site 24 hours, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and make sure that no person causes or creates a fire to be caused within that distance from those sources of ignitable vapors. What I have on the screen now is a certain tank battery. This is a licensed tank battery facility. What I've done is identified tanks and other sources of ignitable vapor on the site. I know the site very well, and drawn a 50-meter red circle around each one. And we can see that a lot of these circles extend well out into the field, well past the supposed site boundaries of this site. Actually, on this site, we're not exactly sure where the site boundaries are, but that's a different topic. So the operator must prevent anyone from farming within these red circles, and they're simply just not doing it. So I'll show you a couple more sites, but before we do that, let's take a look at the well site reduction pilot documentation and go through that. Actually, before I get into that, I just wanted to come here first. This is Bennett Jones' website. They put up a blog on this topic. Alberta Minister of Environment and Protected Areas announces a launch of a partial reclamation pilot project. Bennett Jones represents a lot of oil companies, only concerned with one of the two pilots, which is the well site reduction pilot. What I want to point out is that two things really, but Bennett Jones says that the reduction pilot will provide operators of minimal disturbance sites with the opportunity to obtain partial reclamation certificates in respect of their sites, such that they may be able to reduce the annual compensation payable on those sites to a level that is consistent with their actual ongoing use of those sites. Now, he says that how they do that, and there's 2 points here, and these are important points. So the governing legislation for site reclamation and how it ties into acquisition of land rights, and the giving the use of the land back to the owner when the project's done is all covered by this law here called the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, abbreviated EPEA. Some lawyers call it EPEA. So under this law, and they refer to section 144.1, and that's the key section of this law right there. So it provides that no surrender of a surface lease or no termination of a right of entry order issued by the Land and Property Rights Tribunal is effective or binding on any person until a reclamation certificate has been issued in respect of the specified land affected by the surrender or termination. So what does this mean? So what occurs is that that when a landowner leases a well site or they acquire that site through a forced taking, through a right of entry order issued by the former Surface Rights Board, now called the Land and Property Rights Tribunal, those rights are most of those leases have they just renew automatically. They're indefinite in duration. Right of entry orders are definitely indefinite in duration, but the lease or the right of entry order can be terminated, which means that the land rights revert back to the registered owner from the operator back to the registered owner upon issuance of a reclamation certificate. So section 144.1 says that with a reclamation certificate, you can surrender the lease, and in this case, part of it, and we'll come to that, or you can apply to the Land and Property Rights Tribunal for a partial termination of the well site area covered by a right of entry order. So I wanted to make that point here that a law firm is confirming that, I mean, the only reason to do these well site reductions is clearly to lower the rate of annual compensation that's paid. And then the Surface Rights Board or the Land and Property Rights Tribunal have traditionally ruled that the landowner needs to be paid even if the lease has expired until a reclamation certificate is issued. So let's just hang on and we'll go look at the directive for the well site rehabilitation, or sorry, the well site reduction program. So here's the interim directive issued just a few weeks ago on December the 14th, 2023. It's just over a month from when I'm recording this, and it's pilot for well site reduction. So they refer to this guide for certification for site reductions, additions, overlap, multi-well facilities, and forced lease boundary changes, etc., which is a guide I've relied on before to attempt to get partial reclamation certificates, which I did obtain in the past, prior to 2001. Did actually get a partial reclamation certificate in 2000. When was it? 2007, I guess it was. So anyway, we'll come back to that guide. So it just says that in Alberta, in 2001, Alberta stopped accepting reclamation certificate applications. So let's be clear. The law provides for partial reclamation certificates. You can get part of a site certified as reclaimed. There's just been some policy not to do this, and this policy set out in that guide. So let's quickly, we'll come back to this. Let's go quickly take a look at that guide. So here's the guide, and so it's site reduction is what we're looking for, and that's the first thing they talk about in this guide. So this is the section for site reduction. So it shows a site here, and the B section where these arrows are, that's the area that they say is no longer needed. And then it says reclamation certificate applications will not be accepted for the reduced area. So in other words, it's just purely policy. So as I said, I mean, I know some sites that prior to 2001 did reduce the area like this and did get a partial reclamation certificate. So what we're talking about is that the operator would be allowed to submit these applications, would be able to get the area shown here as Area B, certified as reclaimed, could continue to use Area A until they no longer need it, and then they would have to reclaim that portion of the site and get a separate reclamation certificate for Area A. So that's what they're talking about here, and it is just policy. So let's go back to the interim directive. So this is the interim directive, and it has figure 1, which is here, and then it has figure 2, which is here. So what are we showing? We're showing a well site that's 80 meters by 100 meters, and I've already shown that this site is already too small by law. Minimum well site size, 100 meters square. So we already have a site that's too small. The red is the well bore, and the hatched area here in an odd shape, this is called the teardrop. And they're saying that the rest of the area is undisturbed. So they're saying since it's undisturbed, they should be able to get a reclamation certificate for it fairly quickly. That appears to be what they're saying. So, so over here in figure 2, they're showing something just like we've seen in the guide that we just looked at. So this is the site reduction area, and they're showing that it would be the new well site boundary would be 20 meters from the well here and 20 meters from the well here. Well, this is too close to the site boundary. So now these are my interpretations of the section 8.090 of the oil and gas conservation regulations. This has never been adjudicated, and the AAR should be weighing in on this. So that's where where we need to go with this. So I'm essentially saying that in my submission that this directive should never have been published like it is. So let's be clear. Let's be clear. Operators have the duty to make sure their sites are of sufficient area by law. We've already gone through that under section 8.090 subsection 10 of the oil and gas conservation regulation. So it should have been Bennett Jones's clients. Bennett Jones should have notified Alberta Environment already. Every operator in the land has a duty to advise this minister that what they're proposing here is contrary to public safety laws. Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers has a duty. The industry as a whole has a duty. It's no landowner's duty. It's not my duty, but it always seems to fall to us. So anyway, I'm just going to pause a bit. We're going to take a couple quick looks at a couple more sites, and then I'm going to wrap this up. So this is a well site here outlined in red. It's in an urban area, a residential area. The land development, this is a institution here. This couldn't go here because of the land development setbacks originally. Had to get them relaxed, and so these are too close until that well was actually abandoned. So the well is abandoned now. There was a hearing about this, AR proceeding 411. But what I really want to show is that if we go back to 2002, we can see that there was tank battery equipment on this site, and we can actually see the locations of it. So what here was a wellhead. It was 89. So now when this site was built in 1977, we were still going in feet. So the distance in section 8.0902 in 1977, which is now 50 meters, was then 150 feet. So it's only 89 feet from that wellbore to this site boundary, too close by law. It's only 100 feet to this south boundary, too close by law. This tank is less than 50 meters or 150 feet from that site boundary, too close by law. And we had a flare pit here, which was actually built partially off site. So in fact, the operator took some extra area like this here for its flare pit operations by trespass. So it didn't get a lease, didn't negotiate with the landowner, didn't get a right of entry order, just built the fence out, just took extra property right there for its, and this has all been confirmed. The Alberta Energy Regulator certified this extra trespass area, which I'm showing in yellow now, certified it as reclaimed. The operator clearly used this portion of the land. So this site was clearly too small. So this is one of the sites that I asked the regulator to look at. Now, the main reason why it was too small is that for a long period of time, this operator illegally operated this well, and it blew the well to a tank to lift something called a plunger lift. And this created big plumes of gas that floated across the land according to wind direction. So it's not letting me do it here because of the video, but I'll try again. So I just want to show where this directional plumes of gas would go depending on the wind. So that's a typical shape of a gas plume that this well was doing. And this is my mother's garden right here. This is one of the reasons why I do this. This is my mom's garden here. She was overcome, almost asphyxiated by lack of oxygen here because there was so much natural gas. And they blew this through by lifting a plunger lift. They blew a lot of gas to the tank periodically, about every half an hour. And when that happened, these plumes of gas would float across the land, and they were dangerous a long ways off this well site. So this has never been adjudicated. The AAR came here. There was a complaint made. They permanently shut down this tank battery operation for this activity that I've just explained. But no one's ever decided whether the site was big enough in the first place. So that's one of them. That's one of the sites that I asked the regulator on more than one occasion to look at whether it's sufficient in size, and the regulator has never acknowledged receipt of those. And these are formally filed, property filed, written applications. The regulators never acknowledged receipt. So I got one more quick site to look at. This is another client's land, and then there's no shortage of these. I got a whole host and abundance of these. And as I go around the province, I see these illegal sites from highways everywhere, from roads everywhere. But this tank, again, that tank dike is too close to that boundary. It's far too close. And the farmer farming in this area of this land is again unsafe. So we've seen some sites. Just going to pause here and then I'll wrap this up. So clearly someone needs to deal with this. My current plan has several approaches. First, I intend to refile some applications, formal applications with the Alberta Energy Regulator, asking them to look at these sites once again. And the best thing to do would be to file, for example, applications for those 3 sites or other sites, and ask the AAR individual applications, and then ask for a combined hearing. AAR hearing commissioners, a panel of hearing commissioners, can look at this, decide whether these sites are too small by law or not, the impact of these regulations that I've just discussed, and that decision would be appealable to the Alberta Court of Appeal, and we can sort those rules out once and for all. And that's the best guidance possible for the Honorable Minister of Environment. The Minister of Environment, I submit, has a duty to propose to provincial cabinet. So does the energy minister, to have the provincial cabinet can direct the AAR under their statute to conduct an inquiry or a hearing or a reconsideration of any decision ever made by it, and its decisions to approve these site areas should be reviewed, having regard to the public safety regulations I just discussed. The problem, of course, is that the Alberta Energy Regulator has thrown these applications in the garbage in the past, or refused to deal with these matters in the past. Now, the first tank battery site I showed you, I asked the regulator to review it in 2015. It's a licensed tank battery facility. The field inspector initially said they thought everything was okay, but once I started discussing it with her, she realized that maybe there was some problems, and so she undertook to bring in an expert on Section 8.090 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Rules from the AAR. I welcomed that, but that never occurred. What happened instead is that something called stakeholder engagement at the Alberta Energy Regulator took over. They made a rule that field inspectors weren't allowed to talk to me, and that I had to submit all my dealings with the AAR through that stakeholder engagement section, who then began to manage me. And I've got thousands of pages that came out in hearings later that this, in fact, is occurring, that the AAR will manage people so that they cannot. And the AAR said it was dangerous, and so it's never dealt with my public safety complaints that are real. These landowners are in danger. These sites are too small. Tens of thousands of them, perhaps hundreds of thousands of them, all across the province. So this must be dealt with. The public needs to know. Some pressure needs to be put to bear so that we need to have a return to the rule of law in matters of well site, public safety, and safety of landowners on their own land. So let's be very clear, crystal clear on this point, that the Alberta Bill of Rights says that property can't be taken from anyone other than due process of law. And the federal Constitution guarantees the security of the person on their own land. To be safe on your own land or in your own home is sacrosanct. It's sacrosanct. So these oil companies are only leasing or acquiring small portions of people's land to conduct their operations, and those sites must be of sufficient size, because the landowner has, the operators acquired no rights to the rest of that landowner's property. They don't have the right to have to have gas floating across your property like I just shown you. They don't have the right for a site to be too small and a farmer drive through there and some vapors come off a tank and they get blown sky high. No operator has those rights. So it's time for a return to the rule of law in Alberta. That's what the Polluter Pay Federation that I'm a director of stands for. I think that this well site reduction program needs to be changed so that absolutely we can have well site reductions, but not so that these well sites are smaller than the minimum size required by law. And the process I've just discovered, where the AAR makes findings of law on this, is the best process and the fairest process. And if the AAR might improperly decide it, then the matter goes to the Court of Appeal. That's our system under a democracy based on the rule of law. So let's get back to the rule of law in all matters oil and gas in Alberta, is my suggestion. Thanks for your time. I hope we can solve this problem. Thank you very much.